The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Windsor Castle as 8-year-old Prince George walked quietly beside his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II. It was a crisp autumn day in 2021, and the young prince had asked specifically to accompany her on her daily walk through the castle gardens. What made this request unusual was that George had been unusually quiet for the past week. Ever since he had overheard a conversation between his parents about the increasing pressures the Queen faced during the pandemic. The castle grounds were different that morning. Usually bustling with staff and security, today felt more subdued. The Queen had requested a smaller security detail, wanting some peace during what she suspected might be one of her last comfortable walks through her beloved gardens. She had been feeling the weight of her years more heavily lately, though she would never admit it publicly. As they walked along the familiar path lined with ancient oak trees, Prince George noticed something his grandmother did not. One of the Queen's guard, a young soldier named James Morrison, was struggling to maintain his composure. James had been standing at his post since dawn, and George could see that the man was swaying slightly. The morning had been particularly cold, and the guard had been on duty for nearly 6 hours without a break. Prince George had always been observant, a trait that both impressed and sometimes worried his parents. He watched people carefully, noticing things that adults often missed. As they approached the area where James stood at attention, George could see beads of sweat on the young guard's forehead despite the cool weather. The soldier's face had gone pale, and his breathing seemed labored. The Queen continued her conversation with George about the changing colors of the leaves, pointing out her favorite spots in the garden where she had played as a child. She spoke softly about memories of her own father, King George VI, and how he used to bring her to this very spot during the war years. These were precious moments for both grandmother and grandson, times when the weight of royal duty felt lighter. But George's attention remained divided. He kept glancing back at the guard, his young mind processing what he was witnessing. He had learned about the Queen's Guard in his studies, understanding their role, and the discipline required to stand motionless for hours. He knew they were trained never to move, speak, or show any sign of discomfort while on duty. Yet something told him that this situation was different. As they drew closer to James's position, George could see that the guard's condition was worsening. The soldier's eyes seemed unfocused, and there was a slight tremor in his hands as he gripped his rifle. George had witnessed someone faint once before when visiting a charity event with his mother, and he recognized the warning signs. The Queen, lost in her memories and enjoying the peaceful morning with her great-grandson, continued walking slowly along the path. She pointed to a particular rose bush, explaining how it had been planted in honor of Prince Philip just months after his passing. Her voice carried a mixture of sadness and fondness as she shared these intimate family moments with George. George found himself in an impossible situation. He had been taught to respect protocol, to understand the importance of royal etiquette, and the sacred nature of the Queen's Guard duties. Speaking out of turn, especially to interrupt his grandmother, went against everything he had been taught about proper behavior. Yet his instincts as a caring human being were telling him that something needed to be done. The young prince slowed his pace, falling slightly behind the Queen as she continued toward the guard's position. He watched as James tried to steady himself, the soldier's training fighting against his body's distress. George could see the internal battle playing out on the man's face, the determination to fulfill his duty warring against his physical limitations. In that moment, Prince George made a decision that would surprise everyone present and demonstrate a wisdom far beyond his years. Rather than calling out or making a scene, he quietly stepped away from the Queen's side and approached the struggling guard. Without saying a word, he positioned himself directly in front of James, looking up at the much taller soldier with eyes full of concern and understanding. The Queen, noticing that George was no longer beside her, turned to see what had captured his attention. What she witnessed in that moment would stay with her for the rest of her life. Her great-grandson stood silently before the guard, his small hand gently placed against the soldier's leg, offering what comfort he could without compromising the man's position or duty. James looked down at the young prince, his training warring with his gratitude for the unexpected kindness. In his years of service, he had never experienced anything like this moment. The simple gesture of human connection from the future king was both humbling and strengthening. The Queen watched as this silent exchange continued, her heart swelling with pride at her great-grandson's intuitive compassion. She began to understand what George had noticed, seeing now the signs of distress that had escaped her attention. Rather than intervene immediately, she chose to observe, recognizing that something profound was taking place. Other members of the security detail had also noticed the unusual scene. Captain Williams, the head of security for that morning's detail, approached cautiously, unsure of how to handle this unprecedented situation. The protocol was clear about maintaining the guard's position, but the presence of Prince George complicated matters significantly. George remained motionless beside the guard, his presence serving as both support and silent communication. He seemed to understand instinctively that drawing attention to James's condition might cause embarrassment or even disciplinary action for the dedicated soldier. Instead, his quiet companionship offered strength without compromising anyone's dignity. The morning air grew warmer as the sun climbed higher, and gradually, James's color began to return. The presence of the young prince seemed to ground him, giving him something to focus on beyond his physical discomfort. George's steady, calm presence acted like an anchor, helping the guard regain his composure and strength. As minutes passed, the Queen made her own decision. Rather than hurrying the situation along or calling for immediate assistance, she chose to trust her great-grandson's judgment. She moved closer, not to intervene, but to offer her own quiet presence to the scene. Her actions sent a clear message to everyone present that what was happening was not only acceptable, but admirable. The other guards on duty watched in amazement as their young future king demonstrated a level of empathy and wisdom that spoke to his character. None of them had ever witnessed anything quite like this moment, where royal protocol bent naturally around human kindness without being broken or disrespected. Captain Williams found himself in uncharted territory. His training had prepared him for many scenarios, but not for this gentle act of compassion that somehow honored both the guard's duty and his humanity. He made the decision to allow the moment to continue, recognizing that sometimes the most important lessons in leadership come from the youngest and most unexpected sources. As the morning progressed, James felt his strength fully return. The combination of the warming sun, George's supportive presence, and the time to recover had restored his ability to perform his duties. What could have been a moment of failure or embarrassment had instead become something entirely different, a moment of connection and understanding that transcended rank and protocol. Prince George, sensing that the crisis had passed, slowly stepped back from the guard. He looked up at James one more time, offering a small, encouraging smile, before quietly returning to his grandmother's side. No words had been exchanged, but the communication between them had been profound and clear. The Queen took George's hand gently as he returned to her side, and together they continued their walk through the gardens. However, the atmosphere had changed completely. What had started as a simple morning stroll had become something much more significant. Though neither of them spoke about what had just occurred, as they moved further along the path, the Queen found herself reflecting on what she had witnessed. In her decades of reigning, she had seen countless examples of duty, protocol, and service. She had witnessed moments of great ceremony and formal respect, but what her great-grandson had just demonstrated was something different entirely. Something that went to the very heart of what leadership truly meant. George walked quietly beside her, his mind processing the morning's events in his own way. He had acted on instinct, following what felt right, rather than what he had been taught was proper. The experience had taught him something important about the difference between following rules and understanding when compassion should guide action. Behind them, James continued his duty with renewed strength and purpose. The brief moment of human connection had not only helped him physically but had also reminded him why he had chosen to serve in the first place. The young prince's wordless support had shown him that his service was valued not just as a matter of tradition, but as a contribution to something meaningful and human. Captain Williams walked alongside the Queen and Prince George, his respect for both of them deepened by what he had observed. In his years of military service, he had seen many examples of leadership, but rarely had he witnessed such natural wisdom from someone so young. The captain made a mental note to include this incident in his report, though he suspected that finding the right words to capture what had happened would be challenging. As they approached the castle's main entrance, The Queen paused at a stone bench that overlooked the gardens they had just walked through. She sat down slowly, inviting George to join her. This was clearly not the end of their walk, but rather a moment for reflection and conversation. The Queen looked at her great-grandson with new eyes, seeing in him qualities that could not be taught through formal education or royal training. The morning had revealed something about his character that filled her with both pride and hope for the future of the monarchy. Here was a future king who understood instinctively that true authority came from service to others, not from demanding service from others. George sat quietly beside his grandmother, sensing that this was one of those important moments that adults sometimes created when they wanted to share something meaningful. He had learned to recognize these occasions, understanding that they were different from regular conversations and required a different kind of attention. After several minutes of comfortable silence, the Queen began to speak softly about the nature of duty and service. She explained to George that what he had done that morning demonstrated something very important about leadership. True leaders, she told him, were those who noticed when others needed help and found ways to provide it without creating embarrassment or shame. George listened carefully to his grandmother's words, understanding that she was sharing something important with him. He asked thoughtful questions about how to know when to break rules and when to follow them, showing a maturity that surprised even the Queen. His questions revealed that he had been thinking deeply about the balance between duty and compassion, between protocol and humanity. The conversation continued as they made their way back toward the castle. The Queen shared stories from her own reign, times when she had faced difficult decisions about when to follow tradition and when to trust her heart. She spoke about his grandfather, Prince Philip, and how he had taught her that sometimes the most royal thing you could do was to act with simple human kindness. As they walked, other members of the household staff began to notice something different about the morning. Word traveled quietly among them about what Prince George had done for the struggling guard. The story spread not as gossip, but as something inspiring, something that reminded everyone of the true purpose behind all the ceremony and tradition. In the guardhouse, James was greeted by his fellow soldiers with a mixture of curiosity and respect. They had all heard about the incident, and rather than seeing it as a sign of weakness, they recognized it as something extraordinary. The young prince's actions had shown them that their service was valued on a personal level, not just as part of the institutional machinery of the monarchy. The story reached the ears of Prince William and Catherine within hours. When they heard about their son's actions, they felt a complex mix of emotions. There was pride in his compassion and wisdom, but also a recognition that their 8-year-old son was already grappling with the complicated realities of royal responsibility in ways they had hoped to delay for a few more years. That evening, the family gathered for dinner at Kensington Palace, and the day's events naturally became the center of conversation. George recounted what had happened with characteristic honesty, explaining his reasoning in simple terms that revealed the depth of his thinking. He had noticed that the guard looked sick, he explained, and he thought standing next to him might help him feel better. Prince William found himself impressed by his son's explanation. There was no sense of self-importance in George's description of events, no awareness that what he had done was particularly remarkable. To George, he had simply done what seemed right in the moment, which was perhaps the most remarkable thing of all. Catherine asked George how he had known what to do, given that no one had ever taught him how to handle such a situation. George's answer was simple and profound. He had imagined how he would want someone to help him if he were feeling sick but couldn't ask for help. This basic empathy, applied in a complex royal setting, had led to his wise decision. The conversation around the dinner table that night was different from their usual family discussions. George's actions had prompted deeper thinking about the nature of royal duty and the kind of king he might one day become. His parents realized that their son was already developing his own understanding of leadership, one that prioritized human connection over rigid protocol. As the evening progressed, Prince William shared his own memories of learning about the balance between royal duty and personal conscience. He spoke about times when his grandmother had shown him that true strength often came from moments of gentleness and understanding. George listened intently, beginning to understand that his morning's actions were part of a larger tradition of compassionate leadership. The story of Prince George and the Guard began to circulate beyond the immediate royal household, though always in respectful terms. Those who heard it recognized it as an example of the kind of monarchy that the British people hoped for, one that combined respect for tradition with genuine human warmth and understanding. In the days that followed, The Queen found herself thinking often about that morning in the gardens. She began to see it as a turning point, not just for George's development as a future king, but for her own understanding of how the monarchy might evolve. Her great-grandson had shown her that sometimes the most profound respect for tradition came from understanding its deeper purpose, rather than simply following its forms. James, the guard who had benefited from George's kindness, requested a meeting with his commanding officer to discuss the incident. He wanted to ensure that his moment of physical weakness would not be seen as a failure of duty. But his superiors assured him that quite the opposite was true. His dedication to his post, combined with the gracious way he had accepted help, exemplified the best qualities of the Queen's Guard. The incident became a teaching moment within the military units responsible for royal protection. Officers began to discuss the importance of recognizing that accepting help when needed was not a sign of weakness but of wisdom. Prince George's actions had inadvertently opened up important conversations about the human side of military service and the value of supporting one another. As the weeks passed, George occasionally asked his grandmother about the morning in the gardens, showing that he continued to think about what had happened. The Queen used these conversations to share more stories about leadership and compassion, helping him understand how the incident fit into the larger picture of royal responsibility. 6 months later, the impact of that autumn morning continued to ripple through the royal household and beyond. The Queen had made some quiet but significant changes to protocol, ensuring that guards on extended duty had more frequent opportunities for brief respites without compromising security. She credited these changes to insights gained from watching her great-grandson's natural wisdom in action. James Morrison had been promoted within the Queen's Guard, his superiors recognizing in him the kind of dedication and grace under pressure that exemplified the best of the service. When asked about the incident during his promotion ceremony, he spoke eloquently about how Prince George's kindness had reminded him of the human connections that gave meaning to his duty. The story had found its way into the training programs for new royal protection officers, not as a cautionary tale about maintaining composure, but as an example of how true service sometimes required accepting help and recognizing our shared humanity. Instructors used it to teach young officers that strength and vulnerability could coexist, and that the royal family they served valued their well-being as individuals, not just their function as guards. Prince George himself had grown and changed in the months following the incident. His parents noticed that he had become even more observant of the people around him, often noticing when staff members seemed tired or overwhelmed. He had developed a quiet way of offering help, whether it was simply spending time with someone who seemed lonely or alerting his parents when he thought someone might need assistance. The Queen began to include George more frequently in her daily routines, recognizing that he possessed an intuitive understanding of people that could not be taught but could be nurtured and developed. Their walks through the castle gardens became a regular occurrence, and during these times, she shared with him the deeper lessons of leadership that went far beyond ceremony and protocol. On one particularly meaningful afternoon, as they walked past the spot where George had helped James, the Queen stopped and asked her great-grandson what he remembered about that morning. George's answer revealed how much he had learned and grown from the experience. He spoke about recognizing when someone needed help, about finding ways to offer support without making the person feel embarrassed, and about understanding that sometimes the most important thing a leader could do was simply to care about the people around them. The Queen listened to his words with a heart full of pride and hope. Here was a future king who understood that true authority came from service, not from power over others. His natural empathy, combined with the lessons he was learning about responsibility and duty, promised a future for the monarchy that honored its traditions while embracing the full humanity of all those it touched. Captain Williams, who had witnessed the original incident, found himself changed by what he had observed. He began to approach his own duties differently, always remembering that the people under his command were individuals with their own struggles and needs. The example set by an 8-year-old prince had taught him important lessons about leadership that his years of military training had not fully conveyed. The story eventually reached the public through respectful reporting that focused on its inspirational aspects rather than sensationalizing the details. People across the Commonwealth found themselves moved by this glimpse into the character of their future king, seeing in Prince George's actions a promise of the kind of compassionate leadership they hoped for in the years to come. Letters began arriving at Buckingham Palace from people sharing their own stories of small acts of kindness and moments when someone had helped them through difficult times. The incident had sparked a broader conversation about the importance of noticing when others are struggling and finding ways to offer support without judgment or embarrassment. Schools throughout the United Kingdom began using the story as a teaching tool, helping children understand the importance of empathy and the courage it sometimes takes to help others. Teachers found that the tale resonated particularly well with young students, who could identify with Prince George's age while being inspired by his wisdom and kindness. James Morrison received hundreds of letters from people who had heard about his experience, many from fellow service members who had faced their own moments of physical or emotional challenge while on duty. His story became a symbol of the strength that comes from accepting help gracefully and the bonds that connect all those who serve others. The incident also influenced the Queen's thinking about the future of the monarchy itself. She began to see in George's natural compassion a model for how the institution could evolve while maintaining its essential character. His ability to honor protocol while prioritizing human need suggested new possibilities for royal leadership in the modern world. As George continued to grow and learn, the morning in the gardens became a touchstone for his understanding of his future role. His parents used it as an example when teaching him about the responsibilities that would one day be his, showing him that true kingship involved caring for all his future subjects, from the highest officials to the guards who protected him. The Queen's Guard itself was transformed by the incident and its aftermath. The culture within the unit became more supportive, with senior officers actively encouraging their subordinates to look out for one another and to recognize that accepting help when needed was a sign of wisdom, not weakness. The motto, "Service through Strength," took on new meaning that included the strength to be vulnerable and the strength to care for one another. Years later, when George became a teenager, he would often reflect on that autumn morning and the lessons it had taught him. He came to understand that the moment had been as much about his own growth as it had been about helping James. By choosing compassion over protocol, he had discovered something fundamental about the kind of leader he wanted to become. The Queen lived to see many more examples of George's developing wisdom and character, each one reinforcing her confidence that the monarchy would be in good hands when the time came for him to inherit the crown. The morning in the gardens had been a preview of the king he would one day become, one who understood that true power lay in service to others, and that the greatest strength often came through the simplest acts of human kindness. The story became part of the unofficial lore of the royal family, passed down through staff members and shared during quiet moments when people wanted to remember what made their service meaningful. It served as a reminder that behind all the ceremony and tradition, the monarchy was ultimately about people caring for one another and working together towards something greater than themselves. As James Morrison later reflected, the few minutes he had spent with an 8-year-old prince had taught him more about the nature of true nobility than years of formal protocol training ever could. Prince George had shown him that real royalty lay not in demanding respect, but in extending kindness, not in maintaining distance, but in recognizing shared humanity. The incident had begun with a young guard struggling to fulfill his duty and a young prince noticing his distress. It ended with both of them, and everyone who witnessed it, understanding something profound about the connections that bind us all together and the responsibility we have to care for one another, regardless of rank or station. In the end, Prince George's actions that morning had done more than help one struggling guard. They had demonstrated the kind of leadership that inspires others to be better, the kind of compassion that strengthens rather than weakens institutions, and the kind of wisdom that honors tradition while embracing the full humanity of all those who serve it. The guard had indeed stepped down, not in defeat, but in awe of the character displayed by his future king, and in doing so had helped reveal the promise of a monarchy built on understanding, empathy, and genuine care for all its people.